Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Today, we are performing an autopsy.
An autopsy. Okay, that's a strong start. It implies something is, well, dead. Or maybe something that killed someone.
In this case, it's an autopsy of the American judicial and penal machinery as it functioned and as it was being actively resisted back in 1971.
Right.
But the thing is, unlike a medical autopsy, the patient is still very much alive. The source material we're going to be dissecting is the anthology, If They Come in the Morning. Voices of Resistance, edited by Angela Davis.
Okay, so let's set the scene before we, crack the chest open. It's 1971. This is not the I have a dream era of the civil rights movement anymore. That optimistic phase has, well, it's curdled, or maybe it's just hardened into something else entirely.
It's a moment of extreme fracture. You've got the Vietnam War just grinding up a generation. You have the Nixon administration kicking off what we now call the war on drugs.
And at home, you have the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. There's this feeling in the streets that the social contract hasn't just been broken, it's been, shredded.
Totally shredded. And right in the middle of this perfect storm is Angela Davis.
And most people, they know the icon, right? The afro, the fist raised in the air, the free Angela buttons. But this text we're looking at, it isn't a memoir, is it?
No, and that's a really crucial distinction. If you go into this expecting an autobiography, you'll be completely confused. This book is a tool. It's a collection of essays, letters, legal declarations from people who were, at that very moment, sitting in cages.
Wow.
We're talking about people like George Jackson, the Soledad brothers, Rachel McGee, Bobby Seale, and Angela Davis herself, who was editing this collection while she was incarcerated, first in the Marin County Jail and then later in the Women's House of Detention in New York.
So it's literally a dispatch from inside the machine.
It's more than a dispatch. It's a structural analysis written by the very people the structure was designed to crush. And to really understand this deep dive, we have to grapple with the core thesis of the book, which is, honestly, it's pretty radical.
Radical in what way?
The authors argue that the prison system isn't broken. You hear that phrase all the time today. The justice system is broken.
Yeah, it's the default critique.
But these authors, they argue the complete opposite. They say the system is working exactly as it was designed to work.
That's a heavy claim. Because if it's working as designed, then the mass incarceration, the racial disparity, the violence, that's not an accident. That's the product.
Precisely. The source argues that the prison system is not a crime processing institution. It is a political management apparatus. Its function isn't to stop crime, it's to contain specific populations and to neutralize political dissent.
Okay, I have to push back on that just for a second. Because on its face, that sounds a little like a conspiracy theory. Are we really saying that the guy who robs a liquor store or, commits an assault isn't a criminal, but some kind of political subject? That feels like we're letting actual violent offenders off the hook just to make a political point.
And that is exactly the tension the book wants you to feel. It forces us to ask, who gets to define what crime even is? And why do certain communities get managed by police while other communities get protected by them? The argument isn't that nobody ever does anything bad. The argument is that the state uses the label criminal to strip people of their political agency, to turn them from a person with a grievance into a monster.
So it's about the weaponization of the label itself.
Exactly. And the mission of this deep dive today is to decode what the text calls the incentive architecture of the state. We're going to look at how this machinery converts dissent into criminality.
All right, well, if we're doing an autopsy, let's start with the skin, the surface level, the language.
This is a perfect place to start. And here we have to look at an essay in the collection by a woman named Bettina Aptheker. She identifies what she calls the linguistic shield of the state. She points out this shift that was happening in the early 70s, a kind of rebranding effort.
Rebranding prisons.
Totally.
Yeah.
Prisons were becoming correctional facilities. Prison guards were becoming correctional officers.
Okay.
And most critically, prisoners were becoming inmates.
I mean, on the surface, that sounds better. Correctional facility sounds focused on fixing people. Prison sounds like a dungeon. Inmate sounds more like, someone in a hospital.
Bingo.
Yeah.
That is the trap. It's what the text calls the medical model. If you call the prisoner an inmate, and you call the prison a correctional facility, you are implicitly saying that the prisoner is sick.
Right. They're defective.
They're mentally defective, they're emotionally broken, and the state. The state is the benevolent doctor there to heal them.
So the bars on the windows aren't there to punish them. They're there to, keep the treatment secure?
Right. Think about the power of that shift in language. If I tell you a man is a political prisoner, you might listen to his manifesto. You might wonder if he has a point about oppression.
Yeah, you might take him seriously.
But if I tell you he's an inmate with retarded emotional growth, which is a direct quote the text cites from a San Quentin warden, then you don't listen to him. You pity him,
Hmm.
or you fear him.
It pathologizes the resistance. So if you riot because the food is rotten and the guards are brutal, you aren't a striker with legitimate demands, you're just acting out. You're having a psychological episode.
Exactly. It completely strips the action of its political meaning. You don't negotiate with a virus, you contain it. You don't debate a mental defective, you medicate them. By defining the prisoner as morally and psychologically depraved, the state legitimizes their total lack of rights.
And this brings us right to the central conflict that runs through the whole book, the common criminal versus the political prisoner.
This is the absolute crux of it. The U.S. government, generally speaking, refuses to admit it has political prisoners. To admit that would be to admit there's a war going on inside its own borders.
Right. Dictatorships have political prisoners. Democracies just have criminals.
That's the official narrative.
Yeah.
But the text argues that the state creates this trap. It takes legitimate political dissent. We're talking strikes, community organizing, even armed self-defense against racists. And it reclassifies it all as common crime.
Can you give me an example of how that translation works? How do you turn a political act into a simple crime?
Sure. Let's say you organize a protest that blocks a major street to protest police brutality. The state doesn't charge you with being anti-police. That would be too obvious.
Yeah, that would be a political charge.
Instead, they charge you with trespassing, blocking traffic, or the big one, conspiracy to incite a riot. They take a political act and they wrap it in the mundane, neutral-sounding language of the penal code.
So technically you did block traffic, that part is true. But the why is completely erased. The context is stripped away.
And this is where James Baldwin comes in. The book includes an open letter to Angela Davis from Baldwin, and it is just a searing piece of writing.
What's his take on it?
Baldwin argues that in a system that is fundamentally designed to maintain a racial hierarchy, the conscience of the movement, the person who speaks the truth, is automatically criminalized. To be conscious is to be a criminal.
So Baldwin's point is that if the law itself is unjust, then being law-abiding is actually immoral, and being a criminal in the eyes of that state might be the only moral choice you have left.
Which is a terrifying thought for a society that loves the idea of law and order. But the text goes even deeper. It actually references a legal theory by Carl Schmitt, who was, and this is important, a Nazi jurist, to explain this concept of the a priori criminal.
Whoa, we're citing Nazis now.
The text uses the enemy's logic to explain the enemy's tactics. It's a way of showing the intellectual genealogy of this idea. Schmitt argued that there are certain enemies of the state who are criminals not because of what they do, but because of who they are.
Explain that. How can you be a criminal before you've done anything criminal?
Think of it like this. In a standard justice system, the timeline is, you commit an act, a robbery, whatever, then you become a criminal. The act comes first.
Okay, that makes sense.
The a priori concept flips that timeline on its head. The state looks at you, your race, your political affiliations, your zip code, and decides you are already a threat. You are, in their eyes, pre-criminal. Your identity itself is the crime.
So the actual charge, the jaywalking, the broken taillight, whatever they get you on, that's just the paperwork, the excuse.
It's the pretext. The crime was your existence as a politically conscious black person or a communist or a panther. The specific charge is just the mechanism they use to process you into the cage where they think you belong.
That moves guilt from an act to an identity, and that feels like the perfect transition to the physical machinery. Because if you have a population that you've decided is a priori criminal, you need a system to round them up.
Enter the police. And the text is just brutal in its assessment here.
Yeah.
It describes the police not as protectors of the community, but as an occupying force.
Domestic caretakers of violence. That's the phrase from the book that really stuck with me.
It's a powerful phrase. It draws on Fanon's analysis of colonialism. In a colony, the police aren't there to solve your burglary. They're there to keep the colonized people from leaving their sector and bothering the colonizers.
Right. Containment.
The text argues that in the American ghetto of 1971, the police function is identical. The primary goal is containment. Keep the problem inwards. Don't let it spill out.
And there's this specific mechanism described here that they call the justifiable homicide loop.
Yeah, this is a pattern the text identifies, and it's chilling. Let's walk through the steps. A black youth is killed by police. The community is, of course, outraged. They demand justice. So the system holds a coroner's inquest.
Which sounds very official and impartial, like a real investigation.
It sounds that way. But the text argues that these inquests are pure theater. They almost invariably rule that the killing was a justifiable homicide.
Because the officer feared for his life. That's the magic phrase.
That is the incantation. And once that ruling is made, the violence is legally insulated. There is no crime because the state has investigated itself and found no wrongdoing. This creates an incentive structure where police violence is effectively cost-free.
And if there is no penalty for violence, you get more violence. It's a design feature, not a bug.
That's the argument. But let's say you survive the encounter with the police. You get arrested.
Yeah.
Now you enter the court system. And this is where I think most listeners, and honestly, most people who watch shows like Law & Order, get it completely wrong.
Yeah.
We think of the court as a battleground, right? Prosecutor versus defense. Two gladiators fighting for the truth. That is the myth. The source material calls it the judicial assembly line, and it describes something much more cynical, the courtroom family.
The family? What does that mean?
Think about it. Who is in that courtroom every single day? The judge, the prosecutor, the public defender. They are, for all intents and purposes, co-workers.
They see each other more than they see their own families, probably.
They drink coffee together, they exchange Christmas presents, they know about each other's kids' soccer games, they have a long-term working relationship.
And the defendant?
The defendant is a tourist, a transient.
Yeah.
They come in, they get processed, they leave. The text argues that the public defender is structurally incentivized to maintain good relations with the judge and prosecutor, their family, rather than to zealously defend the client.
Because if the public defender fights too hard on every case, files too many motions, drags things out,
then the judge gets annoyed. The prosecutor gets vindictive, and that public defender's life becomes miserable for the next 10 years. So the immense unspoken pressure is on the public defender to facilitate the process, not to obstruct it.
And facilitating the process really just means one thing: plea deals.
The plea deal is the engine of mass incarceration. The text cites that even back in 1971, something like 85% of defendants pleaded guilty. It's even higher now.
That number is just massive. It's staggering.
It's the only way the system can function. If every single person arrested exercised their constitutional right to a trial, the entire court system would collapse in a week. It would grind to a halt.
But so the system is designed to coerce the plea. The prosecutor comes to you and says, look, if you fight this, we're going to hit you with everything. We'll ask for 20 years. But if you plead guilty today, you can go home in 2.
Even if you're innocent, that's a terrifying gamble to take. You're betting your life against a system that's stacked against you.
It's not a gamble. It's an ultimatum. It's about efficiency over justice. It's about moving bodies from the street to the cage with minimal friction.
And there's another mechanism that was specific to the Angela Davis case, but it speaks volumes about the broader system, the grand jury.
Right, which most people think of as, a check on prosecutorial power.
That's the theory. The grand jury is supposed to decide if there is enough evidence to even bring charges, but structurally, it operates in total secret.
The defense attorney isn't allowed in the room, right?
No defense attorney, no cross-examination of witnesses. It's just the prosecutor, alone in room, telling a one-sided story to a group of citizens and asking for an indictment.
There's that famous saying from a judge, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich.
Exactly. The text calls it a rubber stamp. But in the Davis case, there was a specific procedural abuse that really highlights the containment strategy. In California at the time, the accused was supposed to be entitled to a transcript of the grand jury proceedings.
Which makes sense. You need to know what lies were told about you so you can defend yourself.
It's basic fairness. But in Davis's case, the judge issued an order denying her those transcripts until she appeared in a California courtroom in person.
But wait, she was in a jail cell in New York fighting extradition.
Correct. So the state creates an impossible catch-22. We won't tell you the evidence against you unless you stop fighting extradition. But you can't fight extradition effectively because you don't know the evidence against you.
It's a procedural trap designed to exhaust you.
It's designed to force compliance. It uses the bureaucracy itself as a weapon to immobilize the target.
And that brings us to what the book calls the technologies of legal repression. These are the specific tools, the hardware, if you will, of this containment system. And the big one, the one used against Davis, is the conspiracy charge.
The conspiracy charge is the state's ultimate net. It is defined in the text as a vague crime of intent.
Intent is the key word there, isn't it?
It's everything. A conspiracy charge requires no overt illegal act by you, the defendant. You don't have to pull a trigger. You don't have to rob the bank. You just have to be associated with someone who did, and the state has to convince a jury that you agreed to the plan.
The text mentions the strategic utility of this. It allows for types of evidence that would never be admissible in a normal trial.
Hearsay evidence. For one, he said that she said that they were all going to do it. In a standard murder trial, that's often thrown out as unreliable. In a conspiracy trial, that can be the whole case. It establishes guilt by association.
And this was the absolute linchpin of the case against Angela Davis, wasn't it?
It was the entire case. Let's be clear about the facts presented in the book.
Mhm.
Angela Davis was not at the Marin County Civic Center when Jonathan Jackson staged the hostage-taking that resulted in the death of a judge. She wasn't there. She was miles and miles away.
But the guns were registered to her.
The guns were legally purchased by her years prior for her own self-defense because she was receiving constant death threats for being a black woman who was also a communist and a professor. But because she owned the guns and because she knew Jonathan Jackson and because she shared his revolutionary politics, the state built a conspiracy theory.
They argued her intent was the crime.
They argued that her speeches, her writings, her very ideas created the atmosphere for the violence. The conspiracy charge is a way to bridge the gap between speech and action. It allows the state to imprison the thinker for the actions of the actor.
So it's a way to decapitate a movement without having to prove the leader actually, broke a window or threw a punch.
Precisely. It's a thought crime, dressed up in legal jargon. Another tool mentioned is bail.
Which we tend to think of as just, a financial transaction.
But the book frames it as a tool of immobilization. The text argues that bail is set at impossible levels or denied entirely, as it was for Davis and the Soledad brothers, to paralyze the defense. Think about it. If you are out on bail, you can give speeches, you can raise money for your legal fund, you can meet with your lawyers around the clock, you can rally the public to your cause.
If you're in a cell, you're invisible and silenced.
You are silenced. You cannot organize a legal defense effectively from a solitary cell. And speaking of solitary, the text discusses how they used psychological ward isolation. Angela Davis was placed in solitary confinement in New York. The official justification was for her protection or for mental health observation.
The medical model again. We're not punishing you, we're helping you.
But the function was to break her will, to isolate the activist from her movement and, frankly, from reality itself.
There is one more technology of repression that really stood out to me because it involves this specific story that is just, it's wild, the denial of self-representation. You mentioned the case of Ruchel Magee.
Ruchel Magee. This is a story that gets lost in the shadow of Angela Davis, but it is absolutely essential to understanding the system's logic. Magee was a co-defendant. He was a prisoner who had been in the system for years, he claimed, on bogus charges, and in this big televised trial, he wanted to represent himself.
Which is a constitutional right, isn't it?
Yeah.
The right to pro se representation.
In theory, yes. Magee wanted to fire his court-appointed attorney because he believed the attorney was part of that courtroom family we talked about earlier. He was convinced the attorney was colluding with the judge and prosecutor to sell him out. So Magee stands up in court and demands to speak for himself.
And the court says no.
The court doesn't just say no, they force counsel upon him. Now stop and think about that for a second. Why? Why would the state care if a defendant wants to do a bad job defending themselves? If Magee's some idiot who doesn't know the law, that should make the prosecutor's job easier, right?
Unless Magee wasn't going to play by the rules of the game.
Exactly. Magee didn't want to argue about the legal technicalities of did I do X or Y. He wanted to argue that this entire court is illegitimate. He wanted to put the system itself on trial. He wanted to get up there and scream about racism and corruption and the horrors of the prison system.
And that breaks the decorum of the court.
It shatters the mask. The entire power of the court relies on the appearance of neutral, objective, bureaucratic procedure. If the defendant is on the stand screaming that the judge is a racist and the system is a fraud, it breaks the illusion. It makes the violence of the system visible.
So the legal profession protects its monopoly on the process.
They effectively gagged him, sometimes literally with gag orders and by removing him from the court to ensure the smooth operation of the machine.
It's like the system has an immune response. Any foreign body, any voice that threatens the internal logic must be expelled or silenced.
That is a perfect analogy. It identifies the threat and neutralizes it.
We've been talking about the machinery and the abstract, but I really want to dive into the case studies now. The text uses these stories not just as sad anecdotes, but as data points to prove the theory. We talked about Angela Davis and the gun ownership, but there's another layer to her story that the book focuses on regarding her flight.
Right. When the news broke about the Marin County shooting and that a warrant was out for her arrest, Davis went underground. She ran. Now, the prosecution and the media used that to argue flight is consciousness of guilt. Why run if you're innocent?
That's the standard line. Innocent people stay and fight for their name.
But the text reframes this beautifully. It argues that for a black communist woman in 1971, staying put meant certain death. It meant what they call illegal lynching. So her flight wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a rational survival strategy against a predator state that had already declared her a terrorist.
It changes the entire narrative from criminal fleeing justice to political refugee fleeing persecution.
Absolutely. And then you look at the Soledad brothers, George Jackson, Fleta Drumgo, and John Clutchette. We need to visualize what Soledad prison was like in the early 70s. This wasn't just a holding pen. It was a deliberately engineered pressure cooker.
The text describes the guards actively instigating racial warfare.
This is one of the most chilling details in the entire book. The text alleges that guards would intentionally put rival, hostile groups of white and black prisoners together in the exercise yards. They would, according to the accounts, give weapons to one group or conveniently leave certain cell doors unlocked.
They were literally manufacturing violence.
And then, when the inevitable stabbing or riot happened, the prison administration would point to the violence and say to the parole board and the public, look, these men are animals. We need more money for security. We can never grant them parole.
It's a perfect self-fulfilling prophecy. You create the jungle, and then you point to the violence of the jungle to justify the existence of the cage.
It's it exactly.
Yeah.
And the most heartbreaking case study, for me at least, is this story of James Johnson.
This one really hit me hard, too. Johnson wasn't a revolutionary leader. He wasn't writing manifestos from a prison cell. He was just a guy, a worker at a Chrysler factory in Detroit.
A factory that the text describes as a vision of hell on earth. It was 120 degrees inside. There were constant speed-ups on the assembly line, making the work impossibly fast and dangerous.
Yeah.
And there were racist foremen screaming at the black workers constantly. Johnson was pushed and pushed and pushed.
And one day he just snapped.
He was fired, and he came back to the factory with an M1 carbine. He killed 2 foremen and a job setter. Now, on the surface, it's a workplace shooting, a horrible, violent crime.
But his defense team argued for insanity.
Well, not just a generic insanity defense. They argued for insanity caused by the oppressive circumstances of his job. They essentially put the Chrysler factory on trial. They took the jury on a tour of the plant. They made them feel the heat, hear the noise, see the conditions, and they presented testimony about the relentless psychological abuse.
They argued that the system, in this case, racial capitalism, created the conditions for the violence.
And amazingly, the jury bought it. Johnson was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a mental hospital, not prison for life. But the lesson the text draws from this is profound. The system creates the conditions for violence, pushes people until they break, and then it punishes the individual's reaction while completely ignoring the environmental cause.
It's like kicking a dog every single day for a year and then being shocked and euthanizing it when it finally bites you.
And calling the dog evil and vicious while you do it.
And overarching all of these individual cases is the role of the media and the executive branch. Richard Nixon is a major character in this drama.
Oh, Nixon plays the villain perfectly here. The text highlights how he just obliterated the separation of powers and the presumption of innocence. He went on national television and personally congratulated J. Edgar Hoover for capturing the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis.
Before she even had a trial.
Before she had even been arraigned. The President of the United States declared her guilty to the entire world. How in the world do you get a fair trial after that?
You don't. The jury pool is completely poisoned from the start.
And the media was entirely complicit. They just printed the police and FBI press releases as fact. Pre-trial publicity became a weapon of the state. By the time the trial actually starts, the defendant is already a monster in the public imagination.
So, okay, we have the fabrication of the criminal through language. We have the architecture of containment in the courts, the specific technologies of repression like conspiracy charges, and media narrative reinforcing it all. The big question is, why? Why build this elaborate machine? Why does it endure?
And this brings us to the core of the system's analysis. Structural persistence. The text posits that this isn't just about racism or cruelty for cruelty's sake, though those are present. It's about utility. It's about money and power.
Follow the money.
First, economic dependency. The text explicitly links the modern prison system to the legacy of slavery. We're talking about prison labor. The Arkansas penal farms are mentioned by name, where prisoners were in the 70s still picking cotton for zero pay.
It's slavery by another name. It's that loophole in the 13th Amendment.
Exactly. But it's not just about the work they do inside the prison. It's about them not being outside. The text introduces this really critical concept of unemployment management.
This is the idea of the surplus population.
Right. In the 1970s, as industrial jobs started to de-automate and leave the cities, you had skyrocketing unemployment in black communities. You had a huge surplus of labor that capitalism no longer needed. Now, from the state's perspective, a large group of unemployed, angry young men is dangerous. That is revolutionary potential.
So you find a reason to put them in cages.
You warehouse the problem. You solve an economic problem. Unemployment, with a penal solution, incarceration. It's a way of managing and disappearing a population that has become inconvenient.
And then there's the bureaucratic aspect,
Yeah.
the self-preservation instinct.
The prison industrial complex, although they didn't use that exact term yet in this book, the logic is all there. Wardens, police unions, construction companies that build prisons, politicians who run on tough-on-crime platforms, they all build careers and fortunes on the expansion of this system.
If you shrink the prison system, you shrink their budgets and their power.
So the system develops a biological imperative to grow. It needs more bodies to justify its existence and its expansion.
The text also uses this really heavy term from the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, preventive fascism.
It's a striking term. And the idea is that the system anticipates revolt and crushes it preemptively. It doesn't wait for the revolution to actually happen. It uses tools like wiretapping, preventive detention, and dragnet arrests to neutralize threats before they can fully form.
Like the 13,000 anti-war protesters that were arrested in one weekend in Washington, D.C.
A classic dragnet arrest. You just scoop up everyone. The goal is to nip the revolutionary transformation of society in the bud by physically removing the vanguard. You take the leaders, the thinkers, the organizers, and you bury them in the dungeon before they can mobilize the masses.
So the system endures because it is, at its core, a defense mechanism. It protects the existing social and economic order from any fundamental change.
Correct. According to the text, it is the immune system of the status quo.
This brings us to the final and maybe most important section of our analysis, the title of our show, The Crisis in Perception.
This is the meta-analysis. The question is, why do the American people accept this? Why do they watch the nightly news, see a picture of Angela Davis in chains, and nod along, thinking, good, they caught a criminal?
The text argues that there is a core distortion in how we are taught to see reality.
Yes, the public sees crime and punishment. They see bad actors breaking neutral laws. That is the surface-level perception. She bought a gun, a crime was committed with that gun, she is in jail, justice is served. It's a simple linear story.
But the text says that simple story is a hallucination.
It says the structural layer is deliberately obscured. The public fails to see the political and economic function of the law. They do not see the invisible line of color that so often determines who is a criminal and who is not.
It's the classic surface versus system problem.
Exactly. Surface-level analysis. A black woman bought guns. A crime was committed with them. Therefore, she is an accessory to that crime. System-level analysis. A prominent black woman was targeted for her political beliefs, communism and black liberation. The guns were the pretext. The conspiracy charge is a political tool designed to silence a powerful symbol of resistance.
And the reason this deeper interpretation fails to take hold for so many people is what the text calls bourgeois criminology.
Which is a very academic-sounding way of saying we are trained from birth to blame the individual. If you believe crime is a result of a defective individual, a moral failing, a psychological flaw, then you look at the prisoner to find the source of the problem. You ask, what is wrong with him?
Instead of asking what is wrong with the world that produced him.
The text demands that we stop looking at the prisoner for the source of the problem and start looking at the society that needs so many prisons to function in the first place. If a factory keeps producing broken cars, you don't blame the cars. You blame the assembly line.
That is the fundamental shift in perception. The criminal is a production of the state. The trial is a piece of political theater designed to validate the status quo. And true justice is impossible within the existing framework because the framework is designed for the preservation of hierarchy, not for equity.
It flips the entire script. The prisoner isn't the anomaly in the system. The prisoner is the intended product of the system.
And if you accept that premise, if you truly perceive that reality as described in this book, then you cannot just ask for reform. You can't just ask for better guards or more body cameras. You have to start questioning the existence of the prison itself.
And that is the crisis in perception. Once you see the system for what the book claims it is,
Hmm.
a political management apparatus, you can never unsee it.
Hmm.
Every news report about a trial, every tough on crime speech, it all looks completely different.
Okay, let's unpack that for a moment. Looking at the sheer scale of the mechanism that's being described here, we are talking about a coordination between local police, the district attorney's office, the judges, the media, the governor of California, and the president of the United States. It feels overwhelming.
It is supposed to feel overwhelming. That's part of its power. But the book isn't just about the crushing weight of the machine. It's also about the wrench in the gears.
The voices of resistance.
Right. The people writing these essays aren't just victims. They are combatants. When Ruchel McGee fights for self-representation, he is deliberately turning the courtroom from a place of legal procedure into a political stage. When George Jackson writes his letters from Soledad, he is smuggling his mind and his analysis out of the cage for the world to read.
So the very existence of this book is an act of defiance. It disrupts the containment.
Exactly. It breaks that linguistic shield we talked about at the start.
Yeah.
It tears down the mask of the medical model. It says, we are not inmates. We are political prisoners. And here is our analysis of the war being waged against us.
So bringing this forward, what does this all mean for us today? I mean, we aren't in 1971 anymore. We don't have Nixon in the White House. We don't have the Vietnam War raging.
But ask yourself, has the fundamental incentive architecture really changed? Does the courtroom family of judges, prosecutors, and public defenders still exist? Do public defenders still face enormous pressure to process cases quickly via plea bargains?
Yes, absolutely. Probably more so now.
Is the conspiracy charge still used to cast a wide net over protest movements and activist groups? Are terrorism enhancements, the new version of the conspiracy charge, used to depoliticize dissent?
You could certainly make that argument.
Is the medical model still being used? Do we treat drug addiction primarily as a crime or as a public health issue? Do we treat homelessness as a social problem to be solved or as a nuisance to be policed out of sight?
If the answer to those questions is yes.
Then the autopsy of 1971 is still deeply relevant. The machinery is still running. It might be quieter, it might be more digital, more data-driven, but the fundamental gears are the same.
And that is where the crisis in perception becomes personal for the listener. It's not just about history. It's about how we interpret current events.
Precisely. The book is a tool for seeing.
We've covered a lot of ground today. From the semantic shift of inmate to the structural trap of the conspiracy charge, from the manufacturing of the political prisoner to the economic utility of the prison system.
We have, I think, dissected the autopsy.
And hopefully we've given you, the listener, the tools to see the system a little more clearly, to see past the surface level story and into the deep structure.
That is always the goal.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.